Hello, it's Steve O'Sullivan, and I'm speaking to you from the 19th hole at the Peterborough Golf and Country Club. And I thought that for my seminar, I would try and do a little bit of theology on tap. And I hope that for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm able to share with you key points from the readings on the formation of conscience. And I hope to do this in a unique way. It won't be a linear presentation, with perhaps the exception of Veritatis Splendor, as that provides a theological base for the other readings, and a lot of the key points from those readings we'll be able to pull out and test back against what was in Veritatis Splendor. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at the aim of conscience formation. We're going to look at concepts like freedom and truth and law, and does the law inhibit our freedom, or does it allow us to form our conscience properly? We're going to look at the magisterium and the authority that the magisterium has in shaping the conscience of Catholics. And how much weight do we afford the magisterium versus our own personal experiences, and how our own experiences help us to create images that help our conscience decipher what is good and what is evil. I'm also going to take a look at the role of educators, specifically Catholic educators, and the important work that they do in forming the conscience of Catholic students, as well as the tools at our disposal to help ensure alignment between the magisterium and the work of the church in forming Catholic conscience. All right, so I'm no longer at the golf course. I'm somewhere that is a little bit less tidy and a little bit less formal, but it is still a great place to talk about the formation of conscience, because we do find out too that the family and culture and society does have a role in helping form conscience. But we're also going to take a look at too the role of the magisterium and what the magisterium has to say about its role in having a part in the formation of Catholic conscience. Veritatis Splendor gives us a really, really nice definition of what conscience is. It's the sanctuary of man. Now, please pardon the non-inclusive language, but Veritatis Splendor defines conscience as the sanctuary of man, where he is alone with God, whose voice echoes within him. And that's pretty profound. Within that definition, we start to unpack the framework that our conscience allows us to accept responsibility and be accountable for our decisions. And it really helps us too to begin to discern or grapple with the tension that exists between freedom and truth. We learn too that the law that is planted within us, that inner voice, does that inhibit us or does that free us to begin to really explore and develop our conscience fully according to what the church teaches us? It's a pretty complex and emotional process. It isn't entirely just granted to us through the church. There are lots of factors at play in the formation of our conscience. As I mentioned too, this house here, my home, hopefully we're developing and forming Catholic conscience and Catholic character in our children, and the same thing in our schools too. Natural law also comes into play. That shows us the objective and moral good, but our conscience drives how we apply a decision or make an action in a particular case. We also take into account law, God's law, and that really comes to the front. And when we consider that it is written on our hearts, does that limit us? Are we truly free? Is our conscience our own? Well, that demonstrates too that our conscience needs to be formed, and it needs to be formed in alignment with the magisterium and in line with the teachings of the church. And we'll discuss again, as I mentioned, that later when we learn about how the law can actually free us to form our conscience properly, rather than inhibit us and kind of limit our freedom. So in some way too, that our conscience is that inner dialogue, that inner voice. And that goes back to the definition in Veritatis Splendor, where conscience is the sanctuary of man, where he is alone with God, whose voice echoes within him. But how can we tell? Especially when we're considering our students, you can't see what's written on the heart of someone else. But it really emphasizes and underpins that point that we need to have properly formed consciences. Freedom in this can be a pretty scary thing. There does need to be a set of rules or a structure in place to form conscience and have that normed, have a normative quality or a normative agent to set the standard for what our conscience should be formed toward. Okay, so in reference to the internal dialogue, that's really brought out in section 58 of Veritatis Splendor. And I'll quote, and please again pardon the non-inclusive language, that the importance of this interior dialogue of man with himself can never be adequately appreciated. But it is also a dialogue of man with God, the author of the law, the primordial image and final end of man. And this emphasizes both, well, a couple of things. One, the importance of prayer, and I'll elaborate on that further on in the presentation. But again, it stresses the interior place where our conscience exists. And through prayer, we get there. And actually, I should have really started this seminar with a prayer, as would be the custom in our class. So maybe we'll do that now. And what I would like to do is pray and just have you listen to my words and perhaps reflect on your own interior dialogue, your conscience that you're having as you listen to my prayer. But maybe also through this prayer and this exercise, maybe you'll get a little peek into my own conscience as I open up in prayer for you, and you can get a sense perhaps of the internal dialogue that I'm having with God. We'll begin. Our Father, who...
Yes.
Don't interrupt me. I'm praying.
But you called me.
Called you? I didn't call you. I was praying. Our Father, who art in heaven.
There, you did it again.
Did what?
Called me. You said, Our Father who art in heaven. Here I am. What's on your mind?
Well, but I didn't mean anything by it. I was, just trying to pray for the seminar thing here to demonstrate the internal dialogue that goes on during prayer. I always say the Lord's Prayer before meetings or before presentations. It makes me feel good. It centers me. It sort of brings good luck.
All right, go on.
Hallowed be thy name.
Hold up. Do you know what that means by that?
It means, I don't know. How should I know what it means? It's just part of the prayer. By the way, what does it mean?
It means honored, holy, wonderful.
Ah, that makes sense. I never thought about what hallowed meant before. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Do you really mean that?
Of course. Why not?
What are you going to do about it?
Do? Well, nothing, I suppose. I just think it would be rather good if you got control of things, excuse me, down here the way you have up there.
Have I got control of you? Have I got control of your staff and students?
Well, I go to church.
That isn't what I asked you. What about the bad temper? You really got a problem there,
Hey, stop picking on me. I'm just as good as some of those hypocrites down at the church. I think I'm doing a pretty good job keeping it together.
Excuse me, but I thought you were praying for my will to be done. If that is to happen, it will have to start with the ones who are praying for it, like you, for example.
All right. I guess I do have a few hang-ups. And now that you mention it, I could probably name some others.
So could I.
Well, I haven't thought about it much until now. But I would really like to cut out some of those things. I would really like to know how to help the staff and students that I work with recognize your will within them and see the good in each other. That would be a good thing.
Good. Now you're getting somewhere. We will work together, you and I. Some real victories can be won. I'm proud of you.
Look, Lord, I need to finish up here. This is taking a lot longer than it usually does, and I've got a seminar to facilitate. Give us this day our daily bread.
You need to cut out the bread. You're a little overweight as it is.
Hey, wait a minute. What is this? Here I am doing my religious duty, and all of a sudden you break in and remind me of my faults?
Praying is a dangerous thing. You could end up changing, That is why I'm trying to bring across to you. You called me, and I'm here. It's too late to stop now. Keep on praying. I'm interested in the next part of your prayer. Well, go on.
Well, I'm scared to.
Scared of what?
Well, I know what you'll say.
Try me and see.
Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive others.
How about Professor McQueen?
See, I knew you would bring her up. She gave me a lousy mark on my paper, and now I've got to really cram for this exam. I swear I'll get even with her.
But your prayer, what about your prayers?
I didn't mean it.
Well, at least you're honest. But it's not much fun carrying around that load of bitterness inside, is it?
No, but I'll feel better as soon as I get even. Have I got some plans for Moira?
You won't feel any better. You will feel worse. Revenge isn't sweet. Think of how unhappy you really are. But I'll change that.
You will? How?
Forgive Mariah, then I'll forgive you. Then the hate and the guilt will be her problem and not yours. You may lose the game, but you will have settled your heart.
Doesn't sound easy, but I know deep down it would be worth the effort. And after all, I'm fairly certain I'm the guy who got the dates for this presentation all mixed up. Thank you, Lord, for helping me work through this. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. All right, so also in the readings, we learned about what is erroneous conscience. And that leads us into the discussion on, well, how accountable are we? What is our responsibility toward good and evil? And when we consider that responsibility and how we act, if we're acting toward what is good or toward what is evil, that does our conscience does become sort of like a vehicle to bring us to God, and where we can ask for mercy and ask for forgiveness. And conscience as a judgment or as an action is not exempt from error. So just because you act in accordance with your conscience doesn't mean that you're not capable of making a mistake or having an erroneous conscience. And toward this, Ratzinger speaks of conviction. And we know that a good conscience seeks the truth. An erroneous conscience, as he says, is more home in the dark than it is in the light. And it becomes a place where we become accustomed to sin. And he warns that also the conscience shouldn't be used as a mechanism for rationalization. And going back to the conviction, he uses the example of Nazis or of mafia. Just because they're convicted of something doesn't mean that their conscience is right. So your conviction may act against what is good or what is truth. So informing the conscience, and I think in our role or as human beings, when we're forming our own conscience or working in a pastoral sense in the formation of the conscience of others, looking at it as a conversion toward God and continually looking at ways to seek truth and seek goodness, turning toward the sacred teachings of the church. And again, this is not something that inhibits freedom. We're not locked in to what the church teaches as something that restricts us. Rather, it does open us. And I will go into that a little bit later on. And the church is really at the service of good conscience, because it's through conscience that we can perceive and acknowledge divine law. And we're not forced to act contrary to what our conscience is. So there is freedom in how we make our decisions. And I guess that also ties in back to the internal dialogue that we experienced, that gut feel, right? Your conscience is, and I keep making this kind of hand gesture when I'm talking about conscience because it is something that you feel here, like it is an internal motion and an internal activity. Developing the conscience, Gula pointed out 3 stages where this happens. We touched on it a little bit in the last seminar too. So there's the first conscience, or the synderesis, or the anamnesis, and that's a tendency to know or to do good. There's the moral science, conscience 2. That's the discovery of the good to be done and the evil that is to be avoided. And the third conscience, conscience 3, is the judgment of good. So there's this huge range of interest in forming conscience, and why do we do it? So forming conscience helps us to be moral and be reasonable, and that really kind of underpins the whole theme of this course, being able to reason reason well with a well-formed conscience. And it gives us the principled reasons upon which we can make decisions about how we act or how we move or how we operate in society. And the example that I'd like to share with you now is kind of stems from a little bit that was written on juridical ethics. So during the course of this seminar, I intend to do much of the talking, but I would like to turn things over for discussion to the group. So hopefully some of the questions that I present to you stimulate some sort of conversation or dialogue and even prayer. And the first example that I would like us to consider is a real court case from Ontario, and it comes from my area of expertise, which is education. And this is a bit of a groundbreaking case, and I would just like us to consider maybe the conscience of the teacher that's involved, but also the conscience of the judge who needs to make a decision here. And I'll go through the elements of the case and maybe turn things over to you. And however this is presented, to discuss some of the facts that I'll present to you and where the conscience comes into play in coming up with a resolution here. So in 1981, a 15-year-old boy was in an exercise room with 6 or 7 other students. There was no teacher present. The teacher was in the gym, which was attached to the exercise room, with about 25 or 30 other students. So the teacher couldn't see the students in the exercise room. The teacher gave permission for the student to go into the room. He was in there working on practicing some gymnastics or some sort of apparatus. And there was mats set up, those little thin slab mats. There were other large crash mats available in the school, but they weren't out. And the student attempted a dismount that he had never attempted before, kind of like a backward somersault dismount, and broke his neck. So the teacher's, the question is, was the teacher negligent in failing to supervise and act as a prudent parent? But where does conscience come into play on, and how that teacher is, made that decision to let the students go or not go, or does that change after an accident or not at all? But again, let's stick to the facts of the case here. But that's one thing to consider, is the teacher's conscience and culpability in this. So the Supreme Court found that the teacher was negligent, and that there is a standard of care that needs to be exercised by the school, as I mentioned, that of a prudent parent. And kind of set the standard where that standard can change. Like, as society changes, that standard isn't set. It's really flexible depending on what the situation is. We consider the number of students that were being supervised, the age of the student comes into play, the degree of training that the student had to do it, the condition of the equipment. All these things were considered. But again, the standard of care wasn't met. And the risk of an injury was a foreseeable thing, and the precautions weren't taken. And as a parent, you may have put out the more quality mats or whatever, something to prevent injury, or the supervision, or just not allowed it to happen. So really, the court saw that the school here didn't act as a prudent parent in this case. Now, what was interesting here in how the judge ruled, he didn't rule entirely in favor of the student who became a quadriplegic. He found the board and the school 80% liable, but also assigned 20% of the liability back onto the student. And I found that interesting. So even on the judge's conscience, there's something here, knowing that the student tried something without practicing, was old enough to maybe know a bit better. So there's conscience at play on both sides here. There's conscience on the side of the person who was found negligent, but then there's also conscience on how we make juridical decisions. And sometimes the decisions that we make aren't easy, but they need to be done with a clear and well-formed conscience that knows all the sides of the story and is oriented toward what is good. So let's take a minute now to discuss the aim of conscience formation. Now, the aim of conscience formation is to increase our own personal knowledge of facts and values, and give us the skills that we need to help us solve problems and mediate dilemmas, and really just resolve these things that come forward where we need to decide in a good way rather than a way that can be skewed toward what is evil. Now, as human beings, this formation of conscience happens through our experiences with society, as our own personal experiences, but also the experiences that we have in community with one another. Now, as Catholics too, this is informed by Scripture and by our tradition. And that helps shape our character. And character is also truly connected to our conscience. And our character is not those things that we do that may be seen as a one-off or something that's completely out of character, but rather it's the things that we do, how we act, and how we are that are consistent and that are repeated. And it's interesting that in public schools, character education would supplement what we have in Catholic schools as religious education, because it's the Catholic perspective, it's the values that we share as Catholics that influence our character and influence how we act, so that how we act as Catholics becomes maybe second nature might not be the right term, but really becomes consistent with who we are and how we act on a regular basis. So the first task of conscience formation is to help us see. And our moral response and how we are in our moral life is to respond well according to our conscience to what we see, so that the decisions we make are consistent with what we believe. So this vision that we create is shaped by our faith, it's shaped by our families, it's shaped by our community, and it is shaped by our own personal experiences. And when we experience our faith in a personal way, or with our family and in our communities, those are all related to not just how our character becomes, but also to how our conscience is formed. We learn too about the use of images and how images are at play in our imagination. And now, as a faith formator, or as someone who's working toward conscience formation, helping others to see things from a new perspective, it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversion aspect, and turning back toward God, turning back toward what is good, and guiding our consciences towards the good decision. And really, that ability to question, is this right or is this wrong? That's something that really separates us from the rest of creation. So being attuned to culture, will help us perceive and make judgments accordingly. And when images from our faith inform part of that cultural framework and that we live and that we experience, that'll help influence our character and the actions that we take. Faith formation programs, or formation programs, have 4 specific areas of study: prayer, community life, and pastoral service. And those are key in the formation of conscience as well. And Gula speaks towards 2 of those. One being community life, in that the acquisition of a moral conscience is a cooperative experience, and that's something that happens with other people, that community life. We need mentors, someone who may provide us with an experience or an opportunity to be an apprentice in making moral decisions or moral formation, a model. And there's a saying that good people form good people, and that happens in teaching all the time. And a good model, or a good role model for one person, may not necessarily be a good role model for another, but there is a key there. Maybe that's part of the ministry of leadership, is trying to find good partnerships, or trying to place people with good role models to help them form and help them see in a way that will help others connect. But also, too, friendship. We need friends that will help us influence our values, so we can influence their values, that companionship there, but also help shape our attitudes and our perceptions of how we are living and how we're working. The other piece that Gula speaks about is the images that we have in prayer. And when we're drawn into the gospel and we're drawn into prayer, the images invite us to participate in an interesting way. And it's a pretty complex process. The formation of conscience isn't just done through spiritual practice, but it is there's great potential there for proper moral formation. And this brings up one of the questions that I would like to present to the class, or to the group, or to whoever's watching, is, well, what about the other 2 areas? So we spoke about community life and prayer as being key in conscience formation, but what about study? And what about pastoral service? How do those help form our conscience in a way that is consistent with the teaching of the Church? So I'd also like to discuss, too, the role of the magisterium in conscience formation and how church teachings can provide a normative character or help us norm how our conscience is being shaped. So the church can inform our conscience, but it's certainly not the only thing that forms our conscience. Now, Cardinal Newman connects the magisterium to conscience, and he had a neat little quote there in proposing a toast where he toasts to conscience and then to the papacy. And that without conscience, there wouldn't be a need for a papacy or for without the magisterium. And we see examples too of in Gaudium et Spes and Lumen Gentium that move us toward taking responsibility for our conscience and away from just relying solely on the magisterium as a parent or someone to tell us what our conscience is. There is a role for us to explore and to question and to participate in the formation of our conscience. And that's the submission of the will and submission of the mind. So, we recognize the divine commission of the church to teach, but we also have a responsibility to be open to the teaching and to receive that teaching openly and fairly and in a way that does more than give it a chance. We need to be aware that the church has this obligation and we need to be open to that, but there's still room to maybe not necessarily challenge, but to think about it, question it, and to make decisions based on what the church is teaching in an open way. We need to trust that Christ will not abandon the church. So even though there may be a particularly challenging situation that's come up, we need to trust that Christ has informed the church, and moral issues are dealt with by the church in a way that is concerned with the protection of human dignity and to improve human dignity. And we see this a lot right now in contemporary society. We see it this week where there's going to be some people questioning, is the church right in this sense? But as Catholics, we need to be open to the fact that Christ would not abandon the church and let it slip into error. So the magisterium does speak to moral issues, but conscience does have like a final word on ourselves over the magisterium. And we are not perfect, and the formation of our conscience may not be. But it does not, again, still make the magisterium an exclusive agent in the formation of our conscience. But it is normative, and it does set the boundaries for our freedom. And together with the church, as theologians and as laity, we do need to work cooperatively with the magisterium to make sure that the lived experience of humanity right now is involved in the teachings of the church and the experience of the church. So this would be another discussion question that I'd like to pose to the group, is what would the advantages be of institutional authority, and what are the disadvantages to institutional authority? I see that the disadvantages of institutional authority, may be a lack of collaboration and maybe obscure a little bit the human side of our formation or of taking in or synthesizing what is a moral teaching. So the normative nature of conscience formation, we do set up some rules or some guidelines or some boundaries that may seem limiting. And as a human being, we're constantly, working with, well, my conscience should be free. Why can't I choose to do this? Where does the boundary set for what is good and what is wrong? And I heard Bishop Barron give a really interesting example of how the law frees us rather than limits us. And he used an example, a sports example of, say, for example, the golf swing. You can't just go up, hit a ball willy-nilly. You're going to have a poor result. There are rules to the game, and that when you learn the rules, when you learn the technique, it opens you up. There is an opportunity to play and enjoy the game more than you would if you didn't have the training or have the exercise put in to appreciate the skill involved in doing it. Music is another example. I may have a guitar, but without knowing the rules of music, I'm limited, I'm closed. But if you study music and you learn the language and learn the play and learn the skill, you become free. within the law of music to express yourself and to create something beautiful. So there is something set up by the law that allows humanity to flourish within it. So rather than restrict, the law can be a freeing thing. Now, I wanted to touch on, too, the role of Catholic education in conscience formation and some of the things that we have at our disposal to help. One would be the Ontario Catholic School Graduate Expectations, which provide 8 different examples of things that we're trying to incorporate into the daily lives of our students, so that when they do leave our system, they are formed, maybe not even as Catholics or as Christians, but they do have an understanding of what it means to live a moral life and make decisions, or understand the difference between what is good and what is evil, and orient themselves towards a decision that would be aimed at what is good rather than what is wrong. And in our curriculum, we see things that promote knowledge of the faith, that promote knowledge of the meaning of the liturgy and of sacraments, moral formation with a model of Jesus Christ as it's an example. We teach how to pray, prepare how to live in community, and participate actively in the mission of the church. And just by promoting a spirit that prepares us to be faithful and present as Christians in contemporary society.